Okay, hello everyone. I was just waiting. I think people might be joining us throughout this session. So today's webinar is based on a very successful training event we held earlier this year at the Sound and Moving Image Library at Kelvin Hall, Glasgow. The event was called First Steps, Care of Sound and Moving Image Collections, and it had a focus on collections that were in community archives and heritage groups. So these collections are often looked after by volunteers and are at risk of being lost or are very vulnerable to damage. So the Scottish Council and Archives are once again delighted to be working and collaborating with the National Library of Scotland and their team from the Heritage Lottery funded project Unlocking Our Sound Heritage. Robert Wright is also behind the scenes, the Communications and Operations Officer at SCA, and he will be our tech expert, and hopefully everything will run smoothly. The project manager from Unlocking Our Sound Heritage, Jenny Park, will also be co-hosting this webinar, and you'll have a chance to hear from her later on today. So you will have received a programme for today as part of the email explaining how to join this webinar. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we can gather the questions together and direct them to the speakers. There will also be a Q&A session at the end with all the speakers present and a show and tell. So I'd also like to take this opportunity to show our film that SCA commissioned, Why Archives Matter. It was shown in February at the event, and I think it sums up very clearly what archives are all about and how important they are. Unfortunately, Vicky Plain from the BBC cannot be with us this morning, but I'm sure we'll get a recording from her later. So this session is being recorded. We had to limit the numbers. We can't handle more than 50 participants at any one time. So I will be putting a notice out on Twitter, but also if you keep an eye on the SCA website. Okay, I hope you enjoy today's webinar. Thanks very much.
Why do archives matter? I think archives matter because we have a contribution to make to people's lives. Can we make people's lives better? I don't know. But can we equip people with some of the skills and some of the tools that they need to reflect upon their lives and human history? Yes, we can.
Well, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? Archives contain authentic information that's vital for the functioning of a modern property-owning democracy. People may not think of it as of much relevance to them, but actually archives are vital to their lives. The National Records of Scotland, its origins run right back into the history of the Scottish Crown and Scottish Government over many centuries. The Declaration of Arbroath has been called Scotland's Declaration of Independence, and it's thought to be a foundation document really of Scottish nationhood. It's certainly the best known document that we look after. Anybody can use our records and our services for whatever kind of research, whether it's historical research, for family history research, local history research, but also the statistical information underpins decisions not only by the Scottish Government, but also by local authorities and by the health services and so forth. The archives are very important to us as the national custodian of what's been described as Scotland's collective memory, and it allows us to tell Scotland's story, and we couldn't do that if the archives didn't exist.
I'm Dr. Irene O'Brien. I'm the City Archivist for Glasgow, and the archives tell the story of Glasgow's history. We're responsible, we're the keepers of the city's history, and we tell the story of Glasgow's history from its very beginnings right up to it becomes the second city of the empire in the late 19th century. This here is the common seal of the city, which was established in 1322. It's really important. It's got this really rough image of St Mungo. We think that that really depicts a really great depiction of St Mungo's face. And St Mungo's face actually dominates the corporate records of the city. We've got the records of churches, we've got the records of businesses, in particular records of shipbuilding and engineering, which is a major part of the city's history, clubs and societies. So our collection reflects everything and anything that's happening in the city over the centuries. It really matters that people can make connections with the past. We've actually discovered recently, when we're even telling the early stories, that people really love to find out their roots and trace their history right back to St Mungo in the 12th century. But also in terms of family and local history, it provides a great sense of place and personal identity.
My name is Akib, and we're here today at the Glasgow Asians exhibition. Today we have over 50,000 South Asians in Glasgow alone, and one of the biggest ethnic groups within that is the South Asian Pakistani Muslim community, with over 30,000 of them in Glasgow itself. Colourful Heritage is Scotland's largest online archive of oral video histories from the South Asian elders that came to Scotland many years ago.
Whenever I heard, like sound of the bagpipes or something, I used to feel a lump in my throat. And
there was a massive archival silence within the South Asian community, so what we wanted to do was to try and capture these stories, especially before this first generation of people passed away. We really wanted to try and find out what their experiences were. Recording them as video stories is particularly important because you get to see the story as a whole person.
I had to learn more about the restaurant and the Scottish dishes as well.
You get to hear their voice and also their facial expression, and it really helps to transport you back in time. Our aims are to try and celebrate the achievements that our South Asian community have made, and also to try and inspire the next generation of people coming.
Ploughton is a planned village. It was built in the 19th century when people were cleared from the glens further inland. This little building here used to be a couple of garages, and the National Trust took it over, and they gave us the use of the second half of it to put up some information related to the history of the village. From outside Ploughton, people have this vision of the village as a village of incomers and holiday homes, and there's none of the indigenous population left. And I think it's quite important to protect the heart of the community. We had a project that we thought would take a picture of the inhabitants in every house in the village, just to give a sort of picture of the demographic as it is now, and then maybe take it back in each house into the history, and then in 20 years' time somebody else could have a look at it and do it again and see what's changed.
The Letters and Luckhead Railway is a 2-foot narrow gauge preserving railway. The railway was built in 1901, but it was started in 1897 under the Light Railways Act. Mining in the area has been very important. They've been mining since 1451. It was said that the Lead Hills miners were so good that they didn't need to use any explosive because they were that good at getting the ore out of the hill. So we have a picture of the station as it was. It's basically just a shed with a little waiting room tacked on. And that says it's okay for the train to go. We have a whole range of people visiting the railway. Children usually come along and drag their parents along with them. There's something special about trains and children. You have to wave at a train as it goes past. It's important to keep the engines running, and so that they don't become a static museum piece. And it's important to keep the industrial heritage of the local area.
The
Moving Image Archive is Scotland's Moving Image Archive. We look after films from around 1895 up to the present day. We're always collecting, we're still collecting. We've now gone to born digital formats. We look after Scotland's audiovisual heritage here. We have our preservation facilities here on site, but we also have a really wonderful visitor centre which is open to anyone to drop in for free. It's a digital learning centre, so you'll see that there are lots of screens for people to use. So this touchscreen interface is a bit like a gateway into the collection. You don't need to know how to use a catalogue to use this. There's no searching involved. All you do is you touch the screen and you find a topic that interests you.
I suppose you're wondering why a bus driver should choose a coach tour for his holiday. My answer's simple. I thought it high time I got to know my own country.
I love my job because I get to work with people, and I also get to work with a really wonderful collection that speaks to people. Everyone that I work with who comes to the collection fresh brings something new out of it.
So I hope you enjoyed that film. We're very proud of it at Scottish Council and Archives. I am delighted to say that Vicky Plain is with us and can join us. She is Head of Media Management at BBC Scotland. She's been in that position for over 5 years, and she's worked with digital archives for around 17. So she's very knowledgeable and experienced, and hopefully she's going to share that with us today. Thanks, Vicky.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Yes, sorry, my video won't come up. This is all us adapting. I do apologise. It's been a bit of a frantic morning, but I hope you can hear me okay. I just want to say thank you to Jenny and Audrey for having the Community Archives event today. We all gathered for the first event at the end of February, and I think we can all agree quite a lot has changed since then. But I think it's really shown that how important it is for archives to respond to our communities and the places that archives have within them. How we can rise to these challenges of putting content online, reaching audiences in isolation. Previously we might have seen them face to face, and it hasn't been possible at all over these last few months. And crucially as well, protecting investment and income to our archives when we're all under pressure financially. I firmly believe that audio-visual material in our archives has shown their value through this time. The BBC heavily relied on its archive through the first phases of lockdown in the UK, repeating a lot of classic sport and comedy, music and events, and even some of the more forgotten parts of our broadcast archives, the educational programming and religious events. They all played a part in how we were able to respond to mostly live events and religious gatherings, many things all being cancelled. The level of reuse was unprecedented in my working life at the BBC, and was so heartening to see how the audiences responded to this output. One example that was quite close to me was Glastonbury, which is a mostly annual music event that we hold in the UK. It became a completely virtual event and heavily used archive sets, some of them never seen before in full. One example was the David Bowie set from 2000 was repeated for the first time in full. The audience figures for Glastonbury over this time reached it was about 10 million people that actually reached across the UK, which is the same as the actual live programming. I was actually astonished to hear this when I heard that audience figure. And the glowing responses from the audiences, how it took them back to their youth, or it brought them back to a memory that they'd forgotten, was so important to those of us in the archive. a lot of people just appreciated to be able to see some really great music and not perhaps the material that would be going out just now. So that was just a brilliant example, I thought. Another one was how the archive reach had changed, and we were rebroadcasting classic sport. Notoriously, this is tied up with rights holders and with contracts and sporting bodies. Many offered their content for free to reuse, with live matches all being abandoned at the time. And this was an opportunity to engage with football fans or tennis fans, or big events like the Olympics, showing highlights. This is really unprecedented in our world, and I heard from colleagues all over the world, other broadcasters, that this was a shared phenomenon that we'd never experienced before. So the power of archive is strong, and certainly the reach it has with audiences, the resonance was certainly felt over the last few months. I share these stories today as I strongly believe archives have stories to tell through their audiovisual collections, and those of you here today communicate those stories through your collections. Audiovisual is unique in contextualising stories, and we saw that in the video there, in a way that other collections may not be able to, or with the same sort of depth or richness. And it's a tangibility that other mediums maybe cannot have the same reach. So that's really something that I feel strongly with all the examples we saw in the video, and certainly ones I heard of in our event in February as well. So whether it's recordings of dialects or oral history interviews, local music and sound effects, or footage of events and people, these resources are unique because they're an audio and visual representation of our heritage, our ancestors, and they stand on their own as a historical resource. But in combination with other archive assets, they offer a full picture of where we've all come from and what we might have lost along the way that we can still learn from. Audiovisual archives can be a powerful resource in a museum or archive, and I've seen the successes of the National Library Scotland on screen educational resources for school children. This resource is quite different to traditional written materials. It is much more tangible than a textbook. To be able to see footage of First World War troops, not just read about them in a history class, or to see unique footage of the evacuation of St Kilda has a powerful impact on the viewer. National audiovisual collections like the Moving Image Collection at the Kelvin Hall, or indeed the BBC Archives that I look after, are hugely important to offer powerful glimpses into our social history. But smaller archives offer equal importance. I visited the Orkney and Shetland archives a few years ago and was struck how the audio collections there were vital to serving the needs of their users. Visiting amateur genealogists desperate to hear their relatives interviewed on local radio, or historians poring over local music recordings or oral history interviews. In Orkney, I heard how important the local recordings were in preserving the memory of Orcadian dialects, some of them long forgotten by the local youngsters who no longer speak in that way. In Shetland, the excellent museum facilities were supported with sound effects and audio commentaries, both amazing places to visit if you have the opportunity. But knowing the importance of audiovisual archives is matched by the reality that audiovisual content is often relegated onto the back shelves of some archives. This might be due to their complexity in use, the playback equipment needed, the knowledge to use the equipment, or the longer term preservation needs to keep these archive assets in use. Or perhaps there's just too much content and not enough resource to deal with all the assets in your collections. I've seen through previous National Library projects how passionate and dedicated community archives are, but how they often rely on a few members of staff and part-time volunteers who are just doing the best they can to secure these unique assets for their communities. There's no denying the financial pressures most archives and museums face, the ever-present need for more people, more time and more money to deal with more content we know what to do with. We have a unique challenge in audiovisual archives that most paper-based archives don't face. The timeliness of managing our collections is paramount. The three reasons I mentioned a moment ago, the availability of playback, the knowledge and skill of how to manage this equipment, and the audio and visual assets, and the ongoing preservation needs that also facilitate easy access and, in some instances, reuse. In this evolving area of digital assets and storage, audiovisual assets need a different approach to paper and photographs, adding further complexity to an already challenging environment. But digitised content offers many exciting possibilities for all of us. in terms of reach and access to audiences, as I was mentioning earlier, that we may be unaware of what we're holding in these facilities. Digital curation techniques offers a creative input into our archives that as collection holders we might not have had the opportunity to develop in the past. Curated online collections offer an opportunity to select some of our content and develop access around chosen topics. Support for reminiscence groups is an important and necessary resource that has flourished with accessible online archive assets. With their music, sound, visual images, they all have been proven to help a community of users that might previously have been lost. I've heard of many successful initiatives in local communities that support reminiscence to great success. One example is the Football Memories project, which is part of the Football Archive Museum at Hampden Stadium in Glasgow. This resource offers browsable and downloadable content for use in reminiscence groups. The response to hearing crowds chanting and singing in the terraces triggers powerful memories to those who hear them. The BBC launched its Remark and Music Memories site as free to use amongst reminiscence groups, using content from its photo, sound and television archives. It makes use not just of clips from the programmes themselves, but the idents and title music as they resonate so much in the memory. As online curation of archives can demonstrate such strong public purpose and audience reach, I have no doubt that successfully funding and resourcing archive projects in the future will rely on the ability to demonstrate how archives are used to reach users. I realise I'm talking about how large organisations can use their audiovisual assets, but what can smaller organisations do to harness the power of your collections? You might not even know what audiovisual material you have, never mind what to do with it. This is where the resources they have at the National Library can really come to the fore. Events like today offer you the chance to hear from experts in the field and find what resources are available to you. Some of you may have benefited from the support offered by Scotland Sounds project, its purpose to connect Scotland's sound heritage across Scotland or elsewhere, as we are today. If you haven't already, please sign up to their mailing list and get involved as a stakeholder. The online resources are useful to start your journey into audio collection management, but also to engage with others in similar situations at their regular meetings. You may also know about Save Our Sounds, which Jenny, one of the co-hosts today, is running at the Kelvin Hall. The Kelvin Hall is a hub of this British Library-led project, recognising the urgency in digitising our audio heritage for posterity. Jenny's team are establishing ways of working using a small project resource and a large team of volunteers to manage content onto formats that will offer longevity for the future. These ways of managing audio content will be a useful process for others to consider adopting if they have the opportunity. It's a new world, this world of digitised, curated archives, and certainly at the moment it's pressing us to change a lot and adapt quickly. We're all figuring out as we trial and adapt our ways of doing things, continuing to fight for scarce funding and resources to do what we need to do for our collections. What's important as a community is we continue to share the knowledge, we learn along the way, we work together to solve the challenges that we face. I hope the place of large archive institutions like the National Library of Scotland can offer support to small organisations again and again, as we are today. We're meeting again and discussing these issues. We continue to offer support to small organisations in need of guidance and direction with their collections. Capturing and presenting the uniqueness of audiovisual will only benefit your organisation and your audiences. So thank you to Audrey and Jenny. Sorry for the confusion this morning, but it's really great to be invited back along to this event, and I hope you enjoy your day and get a lot out of it. So thank you very much.
So no, thank you, Vicky. Really interesting. And as I say, we are recording today, and so you'll be able to listen to Vicky again. There's lots of useful information in there. So we're going on now to session 1, which is looking at basic identification and storage of moving image and sound items. So the first presentation we have today is, so what do you have and how can you keep it fresh? So on the day, actually, we had it was really great. We actually got to look at the collections and the study collection which we could handle, and become familiar with. So today you're going to have to sort of rely on the video here, and you'll hear Connor's voice speaking, but Stuart will be available for questions later. So I do encourage you all to use the Q&A button, and we will take in the questions and have all the speakers available later on. So if we can move on to the next video. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you for joining this moving image and sound material handling session. Of course, given the current circumstances, material handling is a bit of a misnomer. Photos of the carriers will have to suffice, even though they aren't as haptic as we'd like. For the sound portion of the talk, we'll be covering 5 disc-based formats, including Shellac and Lacquer Coarse-Groove discs, Emma-Dicta, polyvinyl carriers such as the LP, and lastly, the compact disc. If you're looking for information on magnetic-based carriers, such as cassette and open reel tape, please click on the Kingfisher Blue link, A Brief Primer, Magnetic Tape and Archival Preservation. Following the sound portion of the session, we'll move on to moving image carriers, where we will identify different gauges of film, determine how to tell if a film has sound, the differences between nitrate and safety film, as well as looking at videotape formats and optical discs. As for storing AV material without access to preservation vaults, it is best to keep these items in dark, cool, dry, and stable conditions. In 1895, Emil Berliner began reproducing recordings onto discs with a composite formula, which eventually embodied shellac resin and mineral powders of slate and limestone. Kyle Devine writes of the lac harvesting and production process in Decomposed: A Political Ecology of Music, and I quote, "Shellac is a resin made from lac, the sappy secretion of a beetle native to southern and eastern Asia. Twice a year these insects swarm like blood-red dust in the forests of India and Thailand, and twice a year the twigs they encrust with lac are harvested, crushed, washed, dried, melted, and made into thin sheets which are broken into the familiar flakes of the shellac of commerce." In the lead-up to the electrically powered turntables of the 1920s, shellac discs gained popularity over Thomas Edison's wax cylinders, even while both formats contained a similar recorded duration of 2 to 3 minutes, hence the standard length of a pop song. Yet unlike cylinders, discs can be flipped, allowing for a double duration or a pair of songs on A and B sides. With electric turntables, shellac discs were standardized to revolve at 78 rhythms per minute, or RPM. Colloquially, these discs are known as 78s. As opposed to the microgrooves cut into vinyl records, the inflexibility of shellac necessitated a coarse groove lateral modulation. Shellac discs are chemically stable under relatively dry conditions. However, they are fragile to handle and, if dropped, easily shatter. Shellac discs are heavier than vinyl and colder to the touch. This image shows a metal-based lacquer disc in the process of deterioration. The same disc is shown on the left and right, respectively, from 1990 and 2001. Lacquer, or acetate, are the most common instantaneous discs. They feature a lacquer coating as the information layer, primarily of cellulose nitrate, and a substrate which is typically metal, but can often be glass, cardboard, or paper. The substrate is helpful in determining if a disc is lacquer because you can generally spot it as the center material from the edge of the disc or when peering into the center hole. Lacquer discs are still used today for vinyl mastering. In the 1940s, the synthetic petrochemical polyvinyl chloride, PVC, began being used for disc reproduction. Due to the amorphousness of PVC, manufacturers implemented the hair-width microgroove disc, which was quieter, allowed for greater fidelity, and extended the length of each side to 15 to 25 minutes. With the extended duration, Columbia's long play record was born. An album, which was once embodied multiple shellac discs stored in a booklet like a photo album, could now be contained onto a single vinyl disc. LPs play at 33 1/3 RPM. This slower speed also extends the playback duration. Though chemically toxic, vinyl discs are relatively stable, although they scratch easily and need to be kept away from heat, as the flexibility of the material also allows for warping. Store LPs like books and keep the disc in their inner paper sleeve. It's best archival practice to remove the protective plastic cover around the outer sleeve, but often collectors keep these on to preserve the artwork. And when I say store like books, I mean upright and not stacked. RCA Victor's 7-inch singles, standardized at 45 RPM, are also vinyl discs composed of the same compound as the LP. By the 1960s, the LP dominated the market. However, 7-inch singles were produced alongside the LP and continue to be manufactured today. The Emma Dicta combined the mechanics of a disc-cutting lathe with magnetic recording. This portable version, dating from the 1950s, has a spring motor to drive the turntable and a small generator powering the record head. The head is in the arm above the disc. The recorded discs can be stowed in the lid when not in use. They are made of the same material as magnetic tape. Although rare, Emma Dicta were manufactured in the United Kingdom and are found in Scottish archives. As they were commonly used for dictation, Emma Dicta recordings are usually unique and unlikely to have spawned surrogate copies. In 1982, the disc went digital with the optical data storage of the CD. There are a number of CD formats, with differences that play a critical role in the necessity to preserve and transfer the disc's content. As a general rule, CDs are up there as the most critical carriers to preserve and digitize, even more so than material pressed around the advent of sound reproduction over a century ago. The most robust compact discs are CD-ROMs, which stands for Read Once Memory. These are commercial-grade discs like the ones produced by the record industry. They feature a polycarbonate substrate with the binary code stamped into a metal layer with pits, depressions, and land flat surfaces. The CD player's laser reads this binary topography to decode the content of the disc. CD-ROMs may be impacted by disc rot due to the aluminum layer being oxidized. The CDR is known as a worm device, as they are write once, read many, and thus can be recorded onto once. Unlike the CD-ROM, these are not commercially molded, but rather rely on a photosensitive dye instead of the pit's land topography. These dyes are susceptible to environmental damage, and thus CDRs are of the utmost importance to transfer. The CDRW, like the CDR, is recordable, but can also be rewritten. CDRs then are re-recordable, erasable, and recordable. Now on to the moving image formats. All film formats have the same basic elements: a transparent base onto which an emulsion layer is adhered that holds the image. If it's black and white, there is only one emulsion layer. If it's color, there may be up to 3 layers of different colors. We'll be covering the most common formats, although there are others. Different film formats are easily identified by measuring across the width of the film strip. As the film gets narrower, the picture area decreases, meaning picture quality is reduced, but making it more affordable. Before digital cinema took over, 35mm was the standard for both filming and projecting movies. There are perforations along each side of the film for transport through the projector, and there are 4 perforations per frame of film. 16mm has been used for non-theatrical film, such as news, educational, and industrial films, as well as some low-budget movies. 16mm may have perforations down one side or both. There is one perforation per frame. 9.5mm is an amateur format introduced by Paith in 1922. Unlike the other formats, it has a central perforation between each frame, rather than along the edges of the film strip, allowing a wider area of film to be used so the image size is actually not much smaller than 16mm. However, any damage due to this perforation is more likely to affect the image and be visible to the viewer. Super and Standard 8 films are the same size, but are differentiated by the size of perforations. Standard 8 introduced by Eastman Kodak in 1932 as a cheaper home movie alternative to 16mm. Super 8 was introduced in the 1960s. The smaller perforations of Super 8 allow a larger picture area. There are basically two types of sound that might be on your film: optical and magnetic. For an optical track, the sound is recorded on the same emulsion layer as the picture and appears as a waveform running along one edge of the film. A magnetic track appears in the same place as a brown stripe. Care must be taken with soundtracks as they are easily damaged. For instance, for 16mm film, the soundtrack runs along where the perfs would be on a double perf film strip, so it can easily be damaged by a splicer. If your film has a magnetic track, you should not attempt to clean it, as this will damage the track. In both cases, the sound is read by a separate sound head on the projector, below the film gate, and because of this, the sound runs ahead of the picture, so care must be taken if cutting or splicing the film. Initially, the base material for film was nitrocellulose, or nitrate film. As well as being highly inflammable, the material can start to decompose and give off large quantities of poisonous gases. Warmth and humidity accelerate this decomposition. Since the 1950s, it's been replaced by an acetate base, which is less dangerous but has its own problems, such as vinegar syndrome. If your film is any format other than 35mm, it's unlikely to be nitrate. Likewise, if it is from any time after 1952, it's unlikely to be nitrate. A star printed on the edge of a film denotes nitrate. Nitrate film is often identified with an N, or the word nitrate printed on the edge of the film, and safety film with an S for safety, although if a nitrate film has been copied onto safety film, this may be printed through. As a nitrate film decomposes, it turns amber or brown as it fades. The emulsion becomes soft and sticky, and an advanced disintegration will stick to adjacent surfaces, such as the film can, or the reel itself will fuse together. The film may contain gas bubbles and give off a noxious odor. Videotape formats have been used to store moving images since the late 1950s. Initially, open reel formats like 2-inch and 1-inch tape were used in TV broadcast or recording settings. Later, cassette formats include professional formats like Digibeta, consumer formats like VHS and Betamax, as well as smaller tapes for camcorders such as Mini-DV and Video 8. There are too many formats to cover. Luckily, many of them will have some identifying logo on the cassette. One of the main problems with these video formats is the loss of playback equipment, which in many cases hasn't been manufactured in years. There are also so many formats that are not compatible with one another. You would need literally dozens of machines to ensure you could play back everything. Like film, videotape is subject to chemical deterioration, such as sticky shed syndrome, where the magnetic particles detach from the base of the film and are shed during playback. This can stop playback and hinder any digitization process. Humid conditions can promote the growth of mold on tapes. Storage conditions can prolong the life of your tape. Keep it cool, dry, and stored vertically. The term optical disc refers to a range of disc types where the stored information is read by a laser. The first widely available optical disc format for moving image was Laserdisc in the late 1970s. Despite offering better quality than VHS or Betamax, it never gained widespread use due to its relatively high costs and inability to record from. However, the technology laid the foundation for later optical formats such as DVD and Blu-ray. Optical discs aren't suitable for long-term storage. Because information is stored very densely on optical discs, minor damage or deterioration can cause significant information loss. Commercial discs are less fragile than writable discs, and rewritable are the most susceptible to damage. Sources of potential damage to the disc are poor handling, such as scratching either surface of the disc or bending it. Solvents or adhesives used on the label side of the disc can make it unreadable, as can corrosion of the metal layer. Heat and humidity and sudden changes of temperature can also cause degradation. However, a low temperature and humidity will slow their natural deterioration. As with video formats, technological obsolescence is also a factor. The best prospect for long-term storage of the material on optical discs is regular copying or data migration.
Hello. So that was a very abrupt finish. I wasn't quite expecting that. Sorry about that. So all these webinars, all these presentations are pre-recorded, and I've got them timed very precisely. So we're going on to the next one actually, which is a brief primer, magnetic tape archival preservation. Again, this is going to be Connor speaking. And he's talking about understanding your magnetic tape collection, but he's actually going to be focusing on 4 of the most popular and mass-produced sound carriers. So let's hear it. Thanks.
Thank you for joining this brief introduction to magnetic tape and archival preservation. Although there are dozens of magnetic carriers across sound, moving image, and data storage, I'm going to discuss 4 of the most widespread and mass-produced sound carriers. 2 purely analog, the 1/4-inch open reel tape, and the cassette. And then 2 Sony formats, digital audio tape, known under its acronym DAT, and a magneto-optical carrier, the minidisc. The overview will primarily pertain to the formats themselves, which will include some preservation basics, but I will also briefly mention aspects regarding record and playback mechanisms. The obsolescence of these materials isn't straightforward or linear, and has as much to do with socioeconomic factors such as competing technology companies in pursuit of the consumer base, as it does with temporal qualities such as the decay and deterioration of the format material. This often brings forth the obsolescence of the playback equipment before the sound carriers themselves. The magnetic tape we informally refer to as open reel was developed in Germany during the Second World War. Initially, as depicted in the scan of this AEG pancake reel, the tape was even more open and exposed, merely wound around a metal hub. Incorporating metal flanges was a luxury only afforded after the war when aluminum and steel production could be redirected to the consumer market. These pancake reels, the predecessor to the magnetic formats to follow, was recorded and played on a magnetophone. Although I'm specifically discussing 1/4-inch tape, as it's the most common tape width for home recordings and oral history, 1/2-inch, 1-inch, and 2-inch tape also abide by the same principles and materiality. I should also stress the scan of this messy tape was captured before preservation, when it was neatly tidied and rewound for playback and transfer. In the last slide, I mentioned metal flanges. Here you can see the aluminum spools protecting the supply and take-up reels. The tape leaves the supply reel and passes under the tachometer, which measures the tape speed. The tape then passes under the head block, passing through a magnetic field produced by one of three heads. Left to right, these are the erase head, the record head, and the repro or playback head. To the right of the head block is the capstan, which drives the tape until it's wound onto the take-up reel. Tape machines run at a variety of standard speeds, allowing the recordist to either sacrifice fidelity or the duration of the recording. The faster the speed, the higher the fidelity, but shorter the recording duration. These same principles carry to the digital realm, where speed is superseded by storage space. Magnetic tape has two primary layers and sometimes a third. The oxide layer contains the magnetic coating, a ferric oxide emulsion fused with other binder chemicals such as lubricants and adhesives. The magnetic coating is applied to the substrate or base film. Early tape from the 1930s and into the 40s used a paper substrate. Paperback tape doesn't stretch easily, but is prone to tearing. Likewise, acetate substrates, which were produced from the 40s to the 70s, also don't stretch, but they are very flammable and over time degenerate via vinegar syndrome, a self-catalytic process that can't be reversed. As the name suggests, this issue is easy to diagnose because the tape exudes a strong vinegar odor. Because of the material's flammability, acetate tape cannot be baked. From the 1960s onward, most tape is produced with polyester-based substrates. These material compounds are quite durable, but also prone to stretching and sticky shed syndrome, where the oxide binder detaches or sheds off of the base film, causing a number of possible playback issues. Tapes with sticky shed syndrome can be baked at a low temperature in an environmental chamber. This temporarily resettles the oxide layer onto the base film, offering a short window of playback before the syndrome presents itself again. Some tape features a back coating of carbon black to reduce static and print through. This additional layer is more common with professional tape, such as what is used for mastering. Like speed variations, which either shorten or lengthen the recorded duration, track configuration is another facet to economize a recording's real estate across the tape width. Full track mono utilizes the entire tape width, whereas half track mono and stereo take up half the tape width. A stereo configuration allows for a constructed spatiality to embody a recording, whereas half track mono doubles the length of tape by featuring one recording on the top or left channel and a second recording on the bottom or right channel. 4-track recordings, as eclipsed by today's digital multi-track configurations, allow for 4 separate recordings across the tape width, i.e. one for keys, another for a drum machine, another for vocals, and the final track for a guitar. Just as flanges and spools began to enclose magnetic tape wound to an AEG hub, cartridge formats further enclosed magnetic tape. Now we're going to talk about the format that democratized the recording industry, the cassette, which means little house. This image portrays a reel of cassette tape with half of the cartridge or shell removed. The right tab protects the tape from being re-recorded, transforming the cartridge from re-recordable into a worm device, write once, read many. Inside the cartridge, the tape path is very similar to open reel tape. It passes from the supply reel under a tape guide roller. When under the magnetic shield and pressure pad, a window in the shell allows the tape to make contact with the magnetic field emanating from the record or playback head. There are other circular windows in the shell, so the capstan can penetrate the cell and drive the tape onto the take-up reel. The cassette was invented by Philips in 1963. By 1979, Sony released the Walkman, and Tascam revealed the 4-track cassette recorder. both commodities altered the recording and playback landscape for portable listening and DIY production. In the UK, cassette sales peaked between 1985 and 1995, but it wasn't until 2005 that the cassette remained the most popular format outside of the so-called West. Cassette tape is about half the width of quarter-inch tape, at 3.81 millimeters. It runs at a relatively slow speed of 4.75 centimeters per second. Standard lengths include C30, C60, C90, and even C120. A C60, for example, provides a pair of 30-minute sides. Cassette recordings are across 4 mono channels to accommodate a pair of stereo tape sides. The playback head only picks up a magnetic signal from half the tape width, so you can only hear one stereo recording at a time until flipping the tape to play the other side. This image shows mixtapes and a Walkman predecessor used by astronauts during the Apollo forays. Cassette tape also brought advances in emulsions. There are 4 types of cassettes, although only 3 have their own tab structure on the top of the cartridge. Type 1 is a standard ferric oxide like its open reel predecessor. It's also the most common and known as normal bias. Type 2 tape introduced a chromium dioxide emulsion for a quieter signal-to-noise ratio. Type 3, the rarest of them all, and the one without its own cartridge, was a hybrid between ferric oxide and chromium dioxide. There are only a few tape recorders that play back Type 3 tape. Type 4 tape was introduced as a professional grade tape with pure metal coating, similar to the emulsion used in DAT. Digital audio tape was invented by Sony in the 1980s. It was intended to replace the cassette as the next widespread sonic commodity, but the RIAA's suspicion that the format would open the floodgates for piracy relegated DAT to professional studio use and as a storage medium for many radio stations. And it was eventually eclipsed by the CD. DATs are about half the size of cassette, but slightly chubbier. Unlike cassette tape, DATs are single-sided and striped with a digital sampling rate of either 32, 44.1, or 48 kilohertz at 16 bits. Like Type 4 cassette, they are composed of pure iron particles. And in line with video cartridges such as U-matic, VHS, and Betamax, for striping binary information onto the tape, the DAT passes across a helix head. Although DATs themselves are quite stable, the recording and playback equipment, which was never as mass-produced as cassette decks, are causing the format to approach obsolescence at a faster pace than its predecessors. The mini-disc, also invented by Sony, was produced from 1992 to 2013. They're a magneto-optical disc-based format at either 74 or 80 minutes per disc. They use a proprietary compression algorithm called A-Track. Like CDs, mini-discs can be ripped and thus transferred faster than their real-time playback. With the mini-disc, Sony was able to continue the Walkman line. Because of their portability, they were a popular format for oral history and field recordings. As the photo on the right demonstrates, mini-discs were also used for storage. The high MD contained 1 gigabyte. The Authority in Sound and Audiovisual Collections, YASA, have developed the preservation and digitization standards sound archives across the world practice, including at the National Library of Scotland. These guidelines and the plethora of information they contain are documented in the TC04 and the TC05. Additionally, Richard Hess offers a lot of helpful advice and wisdom in his audio tape restoration tips and notes. Thank you for your time.
So that's great. We've had a look and we've looked at identification. So now we're going to actually look at cataloguing. And it's Rob Smith, who is at the National Library of Scotland. He's an auto Cataloguing Coordinator, and he's part of a small team based at the new Sound Hub at the National Library of Scotland in Kelvin Hall, and their aim is to digitise, catalogue and clear rights for 5,000 sound items currently held by organisations across Scotland. So Rob's focus is on preparing catalogue metadata and mapping that data to 2 different catalogue systems. And here we're going to see how Rob deals with cataloguing audio files. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Robert Smith, and I am the Cataloguing Coordinator for the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage Hub based at the National Library of Scotland. I am going to briefly speak to you today about how we go about cataloguing archive audio collections and some of the things that you might want to consider when cataloguing audio material. Audio collections can be found in a variety of cultural organisations, memory institutions, or privately with individuals. Each of these groups has developed a set of standards and formats for creating catalogue data that best suit their needs. Here we see an array of some of the standards and formats used across these groups. The International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives, IASA, did publish a set of cataloguing rules in 1999. This was, to quote, designed to harmonise with AACR2, a library standard that has now been superseded by RDA. While useful, it is focused on cataloguing published material only, so is perhaps more of a guide to how we approach cataloguing unpublished material, such as oral history recordings. For the UOSH project, we are using a bespoke standard developed by the British Library for their sound and moving image catalogue, SAMI. Using this approach, we catalogue in 2 stages. Stage 1 describes the physical audio carriers found in a collection. Stage 2 describes the recordings found on those audio carriers. We will come to stage 2 later, but now we will focus on stage 1. In many respects, this initial stage of cataloguing acts like an inventory, a really crucial first step in understanding a collection. It allows us to gain an overview of how many items exist within a collection. What audio formats exist within a collection? Are there Coarse-Groove Shellac or Micro-Groove vinyl records in there? Perhaps you have a collection of open reel tapes. What size are the reels? Is there any information about playback speed or configuration? How are the items referenced? Every single item in a collection should have a unique reference number or identifier. This will pay dividends for future preservation and cataloguing work. The Stage 1 cataloguing process allows us to undertake an initial assessment of a collection and understand its constituent parts. This stage is so valuable for gaining a better understanding of what is contained within a collection and helps to inform our decisions in regards to what will be required to carry out preservation work and how long that work might take. There is no such thing as the perfect catalogue, and with a number of options available, we will each find a solution that works best for us. The key is consistency in approach. Even if you do something consistently wrong, that is easier to fix than something that has been done inconsistently. This slide shows us a portion from some Stage 1 catalogue entries. Because we are cataloguing into a British Library catalogue, each item must be given a British Library identifier. In this example, the top line tells us we are looking at UNLS 001/101, the 101st item from the first collection we digitised. The next column captures 3 bits of information for us: the name of the original collection holder, National Library of Scotland, the name of the collection, Scotland's Record, and a unique identifier applied by the National Library of Scotland, MS.22297. In this fashion, we create a digital trail so we know that MS.22297 is associated with UNLS 001/101. Stage 1 cataloguing also offers you the opportunity to hunt for clues about the audio contents of the collection and perhaps consider reorganising it. There are 2 major schools of thought about managing archive collections. The first is that you should document a collection as it has been received, and the second is that you reorganise a collection to better understand and access the contents. You might find that two parts of a single oral history interview are found at disparate ends of a collection. Does it make sense to reorganize a collection to bring similar material together? For the project, we asked these questions on a collection-by-collection basis and usually discussed with curators how they would like the collection to be represented in the catalogue. For the UOSH project, we prepare catalogue data in Excel and submit it to the British Library for import into their catalogue database. Using a tool like Excel is an easy and effective way for managing large amounts of data. It allows you to investigate a collection from new perspectives, spot inconsistencies in records, and discover commonalities in collection material. Excel is proprietary software, so you may want to consider alternative options such as the open source offering OpenOffice. We also use Google Sheets in the project to monitor project progress. If you are in a position of working with pre-existing data, you might find a tool like OpenRefine useful. It has been described as Excel on steroids and allows you to tidy up and clean large data sets. One good basic tip for working with spreadsheets is to keep different types of data separate. Keep dates in one format in one column and keep names in other separate columns. How you decide to structure and represent your audio recordings and data may be very dependent on the system or approach you decide to take. Here we see a basic example of the SAMI structure we use on the UOSH project. Fundamentally, SAMI is focused on audio content, and we organize material to best represent what we term recorded events, single unique recordings found on audio carriers. The hierarchy in the SAMI catalogue begins with a top-level collection entry that describes a whole collection. Here we are talking about UNLS 003. This collection is made up of 105 compact cassettes. The Stage 1 cataloguing I discussed earlier produces product entries. These product entries describe audio carriers. Sometimes audio carriers can be grouped together because we have identified a relationship between items based on their audio content. In this example, we have a single product entry describing two compact cassettes, UNLS 003/29 and /30. They are grouped together as we identified that both tapes carry interviews with the same interviewee. We now move on to Stage 2 cataloguing, and we see here two recording entries. The first is interview 1 with Christine Sloan, and the second is interview 2 with Christine Sloan. We decided to identify the two interviews individually as they were recorded on different days and can therefore be described as two unique recorded events. This next example offers a glimpse of some of the complexities you might encounter when trying to describe recordings. Again, we see two compact cassettes, UNLS 003/4 and /5, that contain two recorded events with the same interviewee, Pat Milligan. Interview 1 is found on tape 4 side 1 and on side 2 up to 11 minutes 49 seconds. The C1 here represents the first cut on the tape. Interview 2 then starts on tape 4 side 2 after 11 minutes 49 seconds and continues on tape 5 side 1, finishing on tape 5 side 2. We capture timecode information to identify the start and end points for each recorded event. To not group these tapes together means we've lost the continuity of the recordings found on them. It also raises the question of how do you best represent multiple recordings found on audio carriers? Do they warrant a single catalogue record or individual records for each unique recording? For example, how would you catalogue a live concert performance? Would you create one record for the entire performance, one record for each musical piece performed, or would you combine both approaches? Now, you might already have a good idea of what audio content you have to catalogue, but perhaps your approach needs to adapt dependent on whether you're cataloguing music, radio, dramatic, wildlife, or oral history recordings. There are commonalities across these genres, such as capturing a recording date, recording location, names of performers or speakers, but there are also specifics that need to be considered. It would be useful to capture a broadcast date or name of broadcaster if you are dealing with off-air radio recordings. Perhaps you can identify who is playing what instrument in a musical recording. Do you know the species name in your wildlife recording? You might have transcripts for your oral history recordings. it might be worth investigating how these can be made accessible alongside the audio online. It is worth considering what might be useful to your users when they are looking to access your audio collection data. What might they want to find in there, and how will they go about accessing that data? Two final points. Once you have digitally preserved your audio and want to catalogue the recordings, half the fun is the anticipation of what you might listen to. The UWash project has given us many surprises. For example, expecting to hear an oral history interview and hearing an illegally dubbed Rolling Stones album instead. Another safe bet is that if your collection is made up of open reel or compact cassette tapes, you're quite likely to encounter off-air radio broadcast material, so keep an open ear and mind about what it is you are cataloguing. Finally, a little traditional cataloguing wisdom from Seymour Libetsky, whose book Cataloguing Rules and Principles was first published in 1953. The first chapter, entitled Is This Rule Necessary?, is a bit of a personal mantra, and I think it's important to always question how we approach the cataloguing of a collection, what rules apply, and whether they work to enhance discovery of collection material. There are fantastic standards out there for cataloguing that allow you to achieve consistently rich and detailed catalogue entries. Some will work better than others depending on your institution, the resources available to you, and your individual approach. Thank you for listening, and please do feel free to contact me if you have any questions.
Hi, thank you very much for listening to that. This is Jenny here. I think you're just going to be able to hear me. We're moving on to the Q&A session. Now I can see that there haven't been too many questions in our Q&A function, but I have been sent some questions in advance. So if I can start with one which would be for Connor and Stuart. We have a question asks, you mentioned about the storage conditions for moving image and sound, but someone has their collection in a loft in a domestic property. Is that okay?
Yeah. Hi, Jenny. Sorry, do you mind repeating just that last?
Yep. Sorry, the question is that someone has their moving image and sound collection stored in their loft in a domestic property, and they want to know if that's okay.
It really depends on the conditions, the environmental conditions of the loft. If it's you know, if it's away from direct sunlight, it's not too drafty, it's not damp, it should be all right. Yeah, the major takeaway in terms of storing both sound and moving image items, if you don't have access to, you know, an archive vault, is just to have stable temperature that's, you know, relatively cool, as dry as can be, and away from direct sunlight and heat sources.
Okay, thank you very much, Connor. Stuart, this is a question for you. Someone has emailed me to say that they had some film digitized by a commercial organisation, but when they look at the film, it's quite bad quality. There's lots of lines and blotches on the film, and they want to know if there's anything that can be done to improve the viewing quality.
If there are blotches on the film, that sounds like it's probably from the original film. The lines sounds like that's probably an issue with the digitisation. So I would imagine if it's lines, there's not really anything you can do with that, because that sounds like it's an issue in the conversion. So sounds like it's an interlace problem. When you have standard definition video or files, it's made up of separate frames of the odd and even fields of the image. And sometimes you have interlace issues where the fields aren't put together properly. So unfortunately, it sounds like that's something that would need to be re-digitised.
Okay, that's grand. Well, I'm sure it's not grand, but thank you. We have a question as well from an organisation, and they have a lot of different formats. They think sound as well as film. Unfortunately, under the current situation, they can't get access to it, but they wanted to know if the likes of Stuart and Connor can give them some help and advice with it when the situation has improved.
Yeah, so this is a tricky one, given that they also don't have access to the collection material. If they were able to get access to it, or if they have some sort of inventory, I think the best first step is to, well, if there isn't an inventory, to create one. And if there is an inventory, to try to just find out as much information about the items as possible. In terms of the few slides in the magnetic tape presentation, where where I discuss things like track configuration and recording speed, any of that kind of technical metadata, often which is written on the tape box or in some sort of track listing in the tape box, anything like that is really, really helpful in terms of being able to judge what type of playback equipment is going to be necessary, and also really the amount of time that is going to be necessary for the preservation and digitization. Again, when it comes to preservation, and I know this may be unable to happen currently without access to the material, it's also really good to go through each item to see if things are moldy or, you know, a little dusty, and just to get a general gauge of the condition of the collection. Yeah.
Okay. That's great. Thank you very much, Connor. I have a question next for Vicky from Fiona. She has asked, how did your non-archival colleagues at the BBC react to discovering your archive when they needed it? Were they amazed? Did they expect you to have everything ever broadcast?
I'd say it's probably a bit mixed. As anyone in archives knows, the more successful you are, the less people know about you, because you work away in the background and it's quite a smooth service. I'd say some people already knew how wonderful we were, and that only confirmed it through the lockdown period. But I'd say it's been lovely to get a lot of praise and a general understanding of the knowledge we have in the archive, which previously might have been overlooked. I think anyone who works in archives might see a researcher will come along and go, I discovered something in the archive, and it's only as good as the people that are organising it and managing it and keeping it for many years that make sure that this is all available for people to discover. So I think there's been general recognition about the importance of the archive, because it's so heavily relied on when the mainstay of production is not available. So maybe a little bit mixed. I do hope that it continues and we continue to get praise and acknowledgement for what we contribute. I'm sure that's not uncommon across archives though.
Thank you very much, Vicky. We have another question from Rory, and he is asking, what should use to repackage audio-video material? So, for example, reboxing. Should it be acid-free boxes? Is it different between sound and moving image?
Yep. I'll just quickly repeat that question. And maybe it's my internet, but the question was dipping out a little bit. But what should we use to repackage AV material, i.e. reboxing? And then the question of if acid-free boxes is appropriate. You brought up video cartridges, and not to make it more difficult than it needs to be, but they're interesting in that because there's so much plastic in the cartridge itself. All of that material, it's almost like, when do you stop with the acid-free layers? I mean, you could even create an acid-free cartridge, for example, but that's sort of besides the point, in that you're definitely correct in saying that acid-free boxes is the best route, especially for material that isn't too plastic heavy. you know, which I know a lot of it is, and not to promote you know, not to too heavily promote a service that we offer at the National Library, but we do have a specialist boxing facility in Side Hill, and they've been extremely helpful for our project in terms of making specialty, you know, bespoke acid-free boxes for whatever format, either video or audio that we come across.
Thank you very much, Connor. I'm sorry that I am having some problems. I've moved on to a portable Wi-Fi hotspot in the hope that you can perhaps hear me a little better now. Stuart, do you have anything about reboxing? Is it different for moving image?
Generally with moving image materials, we keep them in the boxes they've come in, so it would only be if we didn't have an original box for it, because the boxes are actually quite good for keeping them in the right position for like videotapes. You want them to be stored vertically rather than horizontal, so it's quite good to have them in those original boxes if possible.
Thanks, Stuart.
Sorry, if I can chime in too, I'll reiterate too that we also, for sound, we do the same. We only rebox in an acid-free container if the original box is damaged for whatever reason, or if it's, you know, if it's decaying or what have you, or mold damage, or if, of course, if we get an item that doesn't already contain a box.
Thanks, Connor. Quick question for Rob on the cataloguing side. I've been asked if a community organisation only has a small number of items, can they just pop it into their existing catalogue, or should they really be using some specialist software?
Sorry, Jenny, I missed the sort of second half of that question. Is something about community organisation as a small collection?
Yes, whether it should be catalogued into the existing catalogue, or whether they should really do it in some specialist software.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, ideally, from my perspective, I would say that because they are an audio-visual item, they could warrant having their own standard for being catalogued, and may want to be put into a separate system. But of course, if that's going to include additional cost and resource to try and implement that. So especially for a community organisation, it may be a case that you just want to use what's at your use the resources at hand, and sort of at least then the material can be accessed in some form.
Thanks very much, Rob. Any other questions at all?
I was going to say, actually, I mean, we're in good timing, and we're going to probably start the next video if everyone's ready. We will be making a note of all the questions that have been asked, so don't worry if you're not hearing them, and we're going to try and work out how we can make the sound quality a little bit better for Jenny, and hopefully for the next Q&A session it'll be absolutely fine. So I'm going to say, moving on, this next part of the webinar is to do with case studies. So it's people that are actually using their sound and moving image collections, and how maybe you can be inspired and use your own collections for exhibitions and other outreach activities. And the first one here is Be Seen and Be Heard. It's by Maya Darrell Hunes, who's a PhD candidate with the University of the Highlands and Islands. She's based on Shetland, and she's managing digital archives of heritage film as a sustainable community resource. So if we go over to Maya's film. Thanks very much.
Hello, my name is Maya Darrell-Hewins and I'm a PhD researcher based in Shetland. I'm going to talk about the importance of visibility of and access to audiovisual collections and how this can be of benefit to all areas of the work for community heritage groups, from fundraising and income generation to recruiting and supporting volunteers and helping to catalogue material. This presentation begins from the assumption that you have audiovisual material available in your collections, probably in a digital format, but maybe as copies in analogue formats that you feel confident and happy in using. It also assumes you have permission to use material through donation or licensing agreements. You can find presentations on digitising, cataloguing and copyright for community heritage groups on the Scottish Council and Archives Community Archive website. A few things to bear in mind when watching this presentation and thinking how it might apply to your own context. Every situation is different, so take what seems of use to you, adapt it and make it work for you. Don't feel you have to rethink your entire operations and strategies. Implementing lots of new systems and rules in a short space of time is a surefire way of ensuring they won't be followed. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. View them as opportunities to learn, share what you have learned with others, and don't let a fear of making mistakes paralyze you into inaction. Archive work can loosely be divided up into 3 building blocks. Collection, which comprises getting material from donors, getting information about the donation, adding it to the archive collection. Preservation and management. This will be organising information from donors and material, cataloguing and deciding how this material will be preserved. And the final building block is access. So this is providing access to the material and information about the material to users, researchers, the general public. The problem is that in this traditional model, for anyone outside the archive, only the access block is visible. So 2/3 of archival activity is usually invisible. If people outside the archive don't see these building blocks, they aren't necessarily aware of all the work that goes into these areas. For community-led archives and heritage groups who rely on volunteers, don't have a place of their own, or have to fundraise for their work, the hidden aspect creates challenges in justifying and maintaining your work. I think that bringing visibility to all areas of archival work is valuable for community-led archives. This means making some processes visible and accessible, as well as the end result. So, how might this be done, and what needs to be considered? You may have or want to encourage people to volunteer on your archive or heritage project. How will people know you need volunteers, or what kind of work is involved, if you don't make these needs visible? Being open about archival tasks attracts different types of volunteer, and makes it likely that people will stay, that they haven't misunderstood the work involved. Breaking down the archival project into smaller achievable tasks is key to keeping people motivated. They need to be able to see an end to a particular job and feel a sense of satisfaction or accomplishment when it is finished. Find ways to recognise and reward volunteers in their work, for example offering the choice to credit them alongside films they have catalogued, or asking them to pick their favourite film and write why, and featuring this on your social media or website. Be visible when you do the work, perhaps meet in a cafe or a public library. People may get curious and ask you questions, a great way to raise awareness and recruit new volunteers. And remember to keep it fun. If people enjoy themselves, they will stay and they will tell others. If it looks like fun, people will want to get involved. Users of your archive collections can be so much more than consumers of material. They can be potential collaborators who can provide useful information and be part of those other 2 building blocks of film archiving, collection and preservation and management. If thought of as collaborators, making as much of your material visible as possible to your users can reap rewards. Enthusiastic users will identify people and places in your audiovisual material. They will correct mistakes, tell stories related to the material, and track down long-lost relatives. So cultivate them, thank them, and celebrate this engagement. Finally, it can be tempting to keep everything contained on your own website, for example. But how will people know to go there? Better to work across different sites and platforms to engage people in places they already visit. Be aware that different demographics use different platforms and access them in different ways. Can content be viewed easily on a mobile phone, for example? As an example of the valuable information you can get from making material visible and engaging your collaborators and sharing them beyond your own website or social media, this clip from the Shetland Film Archive is a great example. Featuring carding, spinning and knitting, it was posted to the Shetland Wool Week Facebook page. Comments are a mix of factual information and also personal memories. In the 5 months since it was posted, this clip was viewed 148,000 times and has been shared 1,900 times. Visibility and access can also benefit audiovisual archives financially. The Found Archive for the Outer Hebrides ran a GoFundMe campaign in December 2018 to raise money to digitise some film material. They reached their target in 3 days and exceeded this significantly. Most people gave about £20 to £30. I think this campaign was successful because it was about being visible and connecting with people. We were told the name of the filmmaker and we get a picture of them. We were told what the money was for and that this was for a specific single contained thing. There's some information of what the film is about and where it was shot. So we have an idea of what we will see, and remember this is before the group have been able to digitise the material. And there are rewards. A reward for all the community and a personal reward for individuals who donate money. So a crowdfunding initiative is for a specific thing, not necessarily everyday running costs. Another way to raise money to support activities is through licensing of material for archive collections. In 2019, the first year that the Shetland Film Archive licensed their material, they covered 80% of their general operating costs from money received from licensing. By licensing, you provide others with material to use for a fee. Through this, you can develop partnerships with different groups, arts, music, heritage organisations, and even local councils. Universities or colleges often have film or music students who also want to use material. Licensing material has also been a way for the Shetland Film Archive to reach different audiences that they might otherwise struggle to reach. So, by working with the Aylesbury Drama Group on a production, over 664 theatre attendees saw material from the archive of a play last November. The point is that most of this work is done externally to the group, so that it doesn't increase their workload, but does increase visibility and access to the material, as well as generating a modest income. So I just use these examples to support my arguments that visibility, access and reuse are vital to all areas of archiving, and that they also support social and financial sustainability, and are a form of preservation in themselves. Why would people think things are worth preserving unless they know about them, see them, care about them, and see how they can be used to benefit their own and others' lives? Thank you very much.
Nope. So that was, can everyone see me, I hope? That was very interesting, and we're going to go over to our next case study. Can everyone see me, I hope? Sorry. And this is from Dr. Karen Buchanan, and she is a curator of an independent ACE accredited museum, archive and library in Gairloch up in Wester Ross, and since 2013. And interestingly, they raised 2.4 million from more than 30 public and private sector funders to build a new museum for Gairloch. And the museum was opened by Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal on the 1st of July 2019. So very, very recent indeed. And Karen here, the presentation is titled Make It Visual, and it is how we used our oral history collection in the interpretation and displays in the new museum. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Karen Buchanan and I'm curator at Gairloch Museum. We're an accredited independent museum in Wester Ross. We undertook a major redevelopment project, moving to a new building and renewing all of our displays. And collecting and curating oral history was a big part of the project, and training in the recording, documentation and interpretation of oral history was very much included in our project activity plan. So I'm specifically speaking about the interpretation that we undertook as part of our redevelopment project today. And there were 3 different ways in which we used our signed archive in our displays. And that's what I'm going to tell you about. So just a little bit about our objectives. We wanted to open up our signed collection to our visitors within our galleries rather than in a separate space back of house as they had been in our previous building. So we were trying to enrich our new displays through our oral histories, both through the medium of signed, but also by using our signed files as an information and research resource. And we also set out to collect new signed recordings. Initially, these were mainly focused on the history of the building into which we were moving. You can see it there on the slide. It's a former anti-aircraft operations room, a big concrete bunker. So it has an interesting history all of its own. However, other opportunities also arose during the course of the project, and these included an HLF-funded World War I centenary project, but also the serendipitous appointment of a filmmaker. And thirdly, we created new signed files from documents within our archive. So we used the medium of signed as an alternative way of presenting information to our visitors. And I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation taking a walk through our displays, showing examples of the different ways in which signed and moving image were used. We have several listening posts, and we've used a combination of techniques to populate those with signed files. The first one I want to talk about is in our war gallery, and it's an example of creating signed files from archive documents for interpretation purposes. So we have a very evocative series of letters in our archive which were written home by 3 local brothers who were serving overseas during World War I. And these were recorded using local voices and form the content for this listening post. Also on the listening post, we have local voices reading out some of the obituaries for the fallen in World War I as well. We're lucky enough to have a very large lighthouse lens in the museum from our local lighthouse. One of the new display themes in the museum was about the keepers and their families who had lived there before it was automated. We put this display in response to feedback from visitors in the old museum, where the display was really centred around the sort of technical aspects of the lighthouse. So we're trying to introduce the stories of the people here. And we included a listening post on which we used recordings that were created specifically for this redevelopment project. So, for example, we interviewed someone whose father had been principal keeper at the lighthouse in the 1960s. And the first-hand stories he tells are of really great interest. There's a particularly wonderful story about the epic journey that the family undertook from leaving Edinburgh, where his father was previously serving, to arrive at this remote Westeros lighthouse for the first time. So really lovely stories, first-hand stories there. Listening post was really a listening booth I wanted to tell you about. So in the picture here you'll see our Gaelic listening booth, and here visitors can sit, can immerse themselves in the vernacular Gairloch Gaelic. And we're very fortunate to have a wealth of recordings within our archive which stretch back to the 1960s. They were collected by previous curators and other Gaelic scholars. Our Gaelic sound archive is quite well known, but it had remained largely hidden until recently and was only available, I guess, to researchers who knew about it and came to listen to it. We wanted to highlight the importance of the Gaelic language underpinning the cultural heritage of our area. And of course, there's a very strong oral tradition in the Gaelic, so it felt right to bring those sounds out into the museum. Range of different types of recording. These include songs written by local bards, for example. We even have some of the local bards singing their own songs. There's always been a strong bardic tradition in the Gairloch area, so it's an important part of our story. It also includes recordings that tell snippets of the social history of the area. So there's a lovely little reminiscence chat, for example, between two ladies, which tells how people used to prepare their houses and the croft for Christmas and the New Year. And we also chose some stories and some anecdotes from our recordings, but all in local voices and in the local Gaelic dialect. Screen of the listening booth, you can see an example, and while you're listening to the songs or the poems or stories, it's possible to follow the text of the recordings in Gaelic. So this I think is quite useful for Gaelic learners, but it also gives visitors a taste of what the language looks like. And an English translation can also be viewed for those who don't have Gaelic. The song on the screen is it's a clever and a humorous composition by a local bard from Elgin, from the Torridon area. It makes fun of the local postman who got a new clock and was telling everyone in the district what a great clock this was and how well it kept the time.
Watch na clock van clock or count block was of where and posting grandad clock I and dot tick tock 3 o'clock a drach and is na grwain. Tick tock 4 o'clock all stars can grwain. Spisen full an epoch mo hier knock. Ik kies toch se pripe was. Die voor ma clock hoe jem bos. Se heren dot gahwai. Tick tock 5 o'clock and I creelish on the worm. Tick tock 6 o'clock nor voile say am no way. Samak talem baloch toch ik an piano huish. Smurstad en klokke huijem post have je heel doen. Tick tock 7 o'clock and brewing am pork. Tick tock 8 o cloc a jeje mouth na lua sa wolf am Selgin Smith was clocks a cui her was an way William post and clocks of rot sa hen dot gach way Dick tock 9 o'clock amach gemies chachwal Dick tock 10 o'clock clock os nox hobuan sket eis des schiuch na hock kommer lunt an hoi wiese granach niach es mok bedrat rot janun woi Dick tock 11 o'clock Dealish gonna away Tick tock 12 o'clock Your has the gouache Snore he crying and talk Sintik can sneak na huay Bis na handje by kui o'clock Vaiden dot gaway
So I mentioned earlier that we serendipitously were able to make a film for our new displays, and I just like to tell you a little bit more about that. We had planned to have a modern day gallery in the museum, but in reality we didn't have a wealth of objects relating to the post-war period within our collection, but we were approached for help by a filmmaker who was considering making a documentary film about the changes that had happened to life in the Gairloch area after World War II. And after discussions with him and our museum designers, we decided to turn our proposed modern day gallery into a film theatre and to work together on this film. So the filmmaker undertook interviews, and these were used with visual footage which he created, but also images from our own archive, our photographic archive, to tell the stories that he recorded. And I put a link there on the slide to our Vimeo page where you can see some snippets from the film in your own time. This is another example of how we've used our sound files in our displays. And this is simply inserting links to sound recordings within the displays themselves. This example on the slide is in our fishing display. The QR code links to a clip from one of our own sound recordings, which is hosted on Tumblr. But we have others similar that link to recordings on Tupper and Dulchus, which, as you may know, is an online Gaelic sound archive. There are about 50,000 recordings on Tupper and Dulchus from all over the Gaeltacht, and it is a really rich source of history, particularly for the Gaelic, and we were pleased to be able to encourage people to access these recordings through our displays, and the recordings, of course, also add to the stories told within our displays. So just on the final two slides, I wanted to show how we used our oral history recordings as a research resource to inform the creation of displays and their interpretation. The image on the slide shows a model of our museum building, and as I mentioned, it's a former anti-aircraft operations room, which was later turned into a nuclear bunker. We do have in our archive the plans for the construction of the building and changes that were made to it at a later date. We used these as the basis for to build a model of the original layout of the building, which we have on display, and it shows the changes that we've made to the building when we turned it into a museum as well. However, for some aspects of the interior of the model, we relied on recordings that we made with former Royal Ordnance Corps members who'd worked in the building and remembered how it was laid out, how it was furnished, etc. So these recordings were very useful to the two volunteers who made our model for aspects of its detail. Probably one of our best known and probably rarest objects, which is a flat pack outdoor pulpit. It was used by the Free Presbyterian Church in Shellac and possibly dates back as far as the Disruption. The services were held outdoors before the Free Church congregation had building, and even up until the First World War, communion services, which only happened a few times a year, attracted huge congregations of almost 1,000 people who simply couldn't be accommodated indoors in the churches. So the outdoor pulpit protected the minister and the presenter being the singer who led the psalms, and of course protected the Bible from the elements. Playing in our outdoor pulpit in the museum, we have a Gallic psalm recording. It's the 23rd psalm, and it's a recording from our archives of a local presenter who had a very beautiful voice. The singing of the Gallic psalm, as you may realise, is a really quite a unique sound, and visitors who haven't heard it before are quite enchanted by it. And I think those who grew up attending Gaelic church services, for them it kind of puts them back into a moment in time as well. So the sound really adds a lot to the otherwise static display. So I'd just like to finish off by saying thanks for listening, and please do visit. If you are in Wester Ross, we'd be delighted to see you. Thank you.
Well, that was fantastic, and thank you very much to Karen Buchanan of Gairloch Museum. Our last case study is about the singer stories. It's oral histories, community engagement and preservation challenges, and it's by Katie MacDonald, who works at Western Bartonshire Archives, a local authority archive. And it is the singer stories, which is the singer sewing machines, which many of you may remember, and they were made just outside of Glasgow. And Katie is currently focused on the role heritage can play in environmental sustainability and ensure people are able to engage with their heritage and work with people to uncover unexplored history and then bring it to life. So I think you'll see that in evidence today in this next video. Thanks.
My name is Katie MacDonald, and today I'm going to be talking to you about sewing machines, oral history, community engagement and the Singer Stories project. Western Berkshire Council's Sewing Machine Collection and Singer Archive offers a fascinating insight into the manufacture and development of the sewing machine and provides a unique picture of the area's industrial links. The archive is made up of more than 100 boxes of material, and the museum collection includes over 800 sewing machines. But despite the vastness of the collection, there are still a couple of notable gaps. The Clydebank Blitz of 1941 destroyed part of the company's record office, and more records were lost in 1980 when the factory closed. As a result, we hold very little documentation related to how the factory was managed throughout its almost 100-year history, and only hold employee records for the mid-1940s and late 1950s. In order to gain a greater understanding of the factory's social history, West Dunbartonshire Council's Heritage Team developed an oral history project based on the Singer factory and the experiences of those who worked in it. The Singer Stories project was not the first oral history project to take place in Clydebank. Previously, a project had taken place with residents who'd worked in the area's various local industries. The oral histories were conducted in a fairly typical way. We advertised for participants in the local press, and once interviews were arranged, someone from the Council's Heritage Team would ask the questions. When it worked well. However, there were several issues with this approach. Finding willing participants was not easy. A lot of people we contacted felt the stories they had to tell were not important, and many people were reluctant to be recorded. The stories we were asking about were the kind that would usually be told in quite an ephemeral way, yet we conduct these interviews precisely because we want them to persist, and because we want to capture something that can become part of our understanding of history. We often listen to these accounts and point out the speaker's biases or inaccuracies, and as such it's understandable that people may be wary of committing their memories to record. The kind of project can also tend to attract participants who have fond memories of their working lives. It makes sense that those who enjoyed their time working are more inclined to talk about it. If we take Singer as an example, the former workers we interviewed were disproportionately people who worked in the office rather than on the factory floor, people who worked in the cleaner, less manual, less repetitive and less noisy jobs. Another issue is also the way in which heritage is promoted in a local authority context. There's increasingly a need to link heritage with quantifiable outcomes, particularly things like well-being, and as a result, there is an implicit assumption that industrial heritage is something to be celebrated and should promote community cohesion and local pride. In that context, it's no surprise that most participants see it as their role to reinforce this general air of celebration by coming to the interview with their fondest recollections. Another problem we had with these oral histories was reporting bias. This is an obvious point, so I'll illustrate it with an example that was particularly notable. One interviewee was giving an interview about his experience working in Singer. He was asked about his first day on the job and said, "When I walked into Singer's, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven." Afterwards, once the camera was switched off, he was asked, "Don't you think you were laying it on a bit thick with the died and gone to heaven bit?" He said, "No, it's true, I loved every moment of it," and went on to explain that the nature of his job meant he was free to travel from department to department within the factory. This was ideal, he said, for someone who had a side business in dealing black market cigarettes. There are countless instances of people giving the interviewer what they think the interviewer wants to hear, only for you to get the real story once the tape recorder is switched off. The problem here is obvious, as it's only what makes it onto the recording that persists. Finally, the bias of the interviewer must be considered when conducting oral history interviews. For many of the heritage team, they wanted answers to the questions surrounding industrial heritage, how strikes came about, disciplinary methods of management, the repetitiveness of the work, not necessarily how great the canteen lunches were, or how much fun the summer outing was. But these things are in many ways just as important. These were the aspects of people's work that they did enjoy, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, and the pride in what they produced. Oral history can tend to lead to an outpouring of nostalgia, and for us the challenge was how do we capture the messy, contradictory, ambiguous, insightful, and sometimes simply confused accounts of people's working lives in industries that are now long gone. I doubt there's anything that I've described so far that anyone who's engaged in the collection of oral histories won't have come across themselves. And I'm not about to tell you how we overcame all these challenges. However, I did want to illustrate just the sort of thing we were thinking about when we were developing the Singer Stories project, and some of the small steps we took to overcome these challenges. Singer Stories came about, in part, as a result of our recognition that there were still a significant number of people who had stories to tell about their working lives. It's no exaggeration to say that everyone in Clydebank had a connection with the company, and it was not uncommon for people to complain that they, and the town of Clydebank, had become Singerised, so dominant culturally and economically was the company. The Singer Stories project also widened the scope of participants by also seeking out people whose family had worked in the factory and people who had owned or used sewing machines that were manufactured in Clydebank. Interviewing people who owned and used sewing machines, we began to look at the other side of the factory's legacy in Clydebank. For example, what's it mean to earn your living from a machine made by your neighbour? Or how do people feel about Singer and the wider deindustrialisation of Clydebank? The memorialisation of the factory takes on its own agency, and the factory and the sewing machine continues to shape Clydebank even now. With the project parameters set, we then looked at the methodology. Rather than persisting with formal appointment-based interviews conducted by qualified archivists and curators, we decided to look to the community itself and how we could facilitate the community to record its own records. Again, this wasn't exactly groundbreaking, but it was the first time that it had been attempted in Clydebank, a community that had been the subject of oral histories since at least 1979. Recruiting through Facebook pages like Collier Salabanki, a Clydebank community group with over 20,000 members, we signed up 23 volunteers, who generally came to the role with their own interests and thoughts about Singer. We encouraged volunteers to pursue these interests in their discussions and to view the event as less of a formal interview and more of a conversation in which they were a full participant. There are two main advantages to this approach. The first was that a peer-to-peer, informal interview tended to result in a more relaxed interviewee, and the result was that they were thinking less about what they were supposed to say and more about what they actually thought. The second was that the interviewer, themselves a member of the local community, with their own views and relationship with Singer, then became part of the interview too. In other words, we were looking to embrace the biases of the interviewer and accept them, even encourage them as part of an intra-community conversation. As an archivist, it seemed to be easier to live with biases when they were grounded in the subject community themselves, rather than being opposed from the outside. Once trained, we paired our volunteers into teams of two, usually trying to combine technical ability with conversational confidence. Each team picked a 2.5-hour slot and were then more or less let loose in Clydebank Town Hall, which is usually busy with local people and seemed to us to be the ideal base for our volunteers. Across 16 weeks, we gathered 24 recordings with 46 interviewees and a total of 498 minutes of recording. In terms of evaluating the success of the project, we'd certainly managed to record more interviews than in any previous project. Listening back, the recordings were of a good quality, and the interviews themselves were wide-ranging, organic explorations of people's past and their memories. Each interviewer had a distinct style, and the result is a somewhat eclectic collection of oral history recordings. These interviews are telling in themselves, as they demonstrate the kind of stories about Singer that had become internalised by members of the community, who are then, in their role as oral historian, surprised when these stories are challenged by people who actually worked in the factory. Listening back, you can sometimes experience a degree of frustration, as in, why don't you ask them this? Or why don't you follow up on that? However, there are too many instances to count when our volunteers asked a question that would never have occurred to us, and they were able to have conversations that we would never have been able to have in the first place. The challenge we have now is ensuring that these interviews remain accessible to future generations of bankies and other researchers to listen to and engage with. We're also aware that digital files are vulnerable to corruption and format obsolescence, so maintaining the integrity of these recordings is essential. Oral histories are a popular type of outreach project because they can often be undertaken on a low or even no budget, especially if you already have the equipment and people willing to put in the time. Often, the cost of preserving the digital files that are created is not budgeted for, and this puts the aftercare of the collection and the recorded histories at risk. These files will need to be maintained and cared for long after the original project is finished, so it's important to consider the budget that will be required for this. When undertaking an oral history project, it's also important to consider at the start what technology choices you're making, as these can complicate things when it comes to preserving the recordings. Video cameras and dictaphones may have their own proprietary formats, meaning the file they produce is specific to the brand of hardware and could result in the files that you have being in a format that's hard to maintain and may corrupt easily. The National Archives Pronom website is a useful source of information regarding different file types, including those from proprietary software. Having created these brilliant oral histories, the big challenge for us now is working out how to preserve them for the long term. I'm not going to pretend we have all the answers. We're currently still looking to ensure that the Council's digital records can be maintained on some kind of system. And in the short term, we're making sure that the files we have are ready for that long-term system. We've created checksums for our digital files, and this allows us to ensure that the files we have is in the original format and has not become corrupted. We've also created copies of these digital records, ensuring that they are stored in different places pieces of hardware and in the cloud, and these copies are also held apart geographically, so if a disaster hits Dumbarton, for example, we have a copy in Clydebank and the recording is not lost. Oral histories cannot capture everything, but they do allow us to fill in the gaps in the narratives of traditional collections, especially where marginalised voices, such as those of the working class, women, LGBT and BAME communities, have been erased. Where oral histories have been created to reflect these gaps, it's essential that digital records are maintained to ensure that the important lived experiences of overlooked communities does not continue to be erased. Thank you.
First of all, before we move on to the Q&A, could somebody confirm if you're now hearing me okay?
Yep, you sound pretty good to me, Jenny.
Okay, I have ticked every box and unticked every setting and relogged on and changed Wi-Fi, so hopefully that will maintain throughout Storm Francis. The first question that we have, and sorry, first of all I should say thank you very much to Maya, to Karen and to Katie for their presentations. They're incredibly interesting. And the first question is for Maya. She's asked, could you comment on the ethical considerations of licensing material to third parties when copyright may also exist with original contributors?
Yes, that's a great question. So how the Shetland Film Archive deals with copyrights, obviously they asked it was part of their agreements, the donors sign over the rights to the material to the archive. However, the archive gives them the options to sort of say if there's things they want the material to be used for or they don't want. So some, very few, but some donors have said they don't want material to be put online, for example. So that's part of the donor agreement, and we do have conversations with some donors when licensees approach us to work with us or use the material. So it does mean maintaining long-term relationships with donors, often talking to them about the uses. It is still quite a new thing for the archives, so I would say that it's something we're still working through ethically as well. And the people we've worked with so far have all been in Shetland, so I guess if a company, rather than say a sort of community group or sort of voluntary group wanted to work with it, it might be a different thing. But I think at the moment it's still a little bit of a case of working through each case as a unique thing. But yes, it's obviously something very important to consider. And the way we've dealt with that has been to have those conversations with donors, which might be impractical, again, as things grow or as the donors pass away, but certainly a work in progress and certainly something important to think about. Hopefully that's helpful.
That's great, Maya. Thank you very much indeed. I'm getting some feedback that there's still some problems hearing me. So what I'll do is there's another question and I'll hand over to Audrey to ask that.
Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. It's from Dietrich and it says, do you have a digital preservation strategy for storing these? And if so, what is the best thing to do for long-term sustainability? So that really could go to any or all of the speakers. Maybe we could start with Karen first.
Sure, thank you. The answer to that is that as a graduate of Glasgow University's Information Management and Preservation master's degree, I'm acutely aware of the importance of a digital preservation strategy. However, as an under-resourced independent museum, I'm afraid it's something that we just haven't got in place. So I think that the short answer is we're doing it on an ad hoc basis. I'm happy that I have sufficiently backed up our materials. And I would also say that the Unlocking Scotland Signs project that we are currently part of has been a big help in that, because it has not only forced us to think more about this, but it also means that the majority of our recordings will actually be backed up with National Library of Scotland as well as being available.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Karen. I'm going to ask the same question to all of them. So maybe Katie, could you answer next? Have you anything to add to what Karen has said?
Yeah, I think essentially we are in somewhat of the same position. We're aware that we need to be preserving these, but aren't quite there yet. As a local authority, all the local authorities across Scotland at the moment are planning to do the same thing. It's just working out what the best same thing to do is. So that is taking quite a long time, but in the meantime, we're doing sort of the same as Karen just mentioned, making sure that things are backed up, making sure that we know what we have, so things aren't kind of going astray. And then hopefully once we get that system brought in, we can just kind of plonk them all in really quickly. But yeah, it's a challenge of resources and expertise. So yeah, we're getting there, but it's definitely not a quick process.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask Maya the same question, but I'm thinking very much coming from a community perspective here. Maya, I mean, is the whole thing of cost a huge issue for you, or less so?
Yes, it's similar to Katie and Karen. Really, we do back up, and we back up to the cloud, and we also have separate copies geographically. That isn't professional storage. That's the best we can do as a community group. That's the Shetland Film Archive, by the way. I think personally, I'm very interested in kind of, I guess, a lot of discussions about more open access as a form of preservation. So it sort of goes against what we might feel, but the idea that lots of copies can keep material safe. So there's a project called Locks, which is a way of keeping material safe by having multiple copies, and the idea that the more copies you have around the world, the more likely something will be preserved. So I guess that opens it up to arguments about whether you want your material to be available somehow in the future, or whether it has to be under particular conditions that you want to control. So I think there's like interesting discussions more widely to be had about, you know, if we kind of were more comfortable with making things, you know, people being able to copy them or sharing them more widely, actually for the long term that might be a solution.
Right.
But obviously there is copyright issues, there are ethical issues about that. So I think that opens up wider debates. But for a community group, that's something that, again, I guess like Katie and like Karen, we're struggling with. The Digital Preservation Coalition has really great resources about starting to think about those things at whatever scale. So I would really recommend their resources as well, as something to look at for that.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Rory Wisher, and it's about funding. And it says, who can we apply to for funding outside the well-known funders like the NLHF for AV digitisation projects? I might go to Karen again first here, because I sort of did at the intro about your amazing fundraising that you did to open the new Gairloch Museum. Karen, have you got any tips for Rory here?
Oh, can you just run the first part of the question past me? I didn't specifically the sort of material that the funding.
Yeah, so it's looking at AV digitization projects, and it's who can we apply to go to for funding apart from, you know, the National Lottery, of course. Is there any other funders out there?
Well, I have to say, as someone who's kind of spanning the worlds of museum and archives, I have always found that there is a lot more funding available in the museum world than in the archive world. I don't know what the reason for that is, but you know, there are organisations like Museums Gallery Scotland and the Association of Independent Museums and the Museums Association, all of these kind of sector specific, as well as Esme Fairbairn, and there's a lot more in the museum side of things. And I do wonder whether archives, if we're talking about here making collections accessible, whether archives might be eligible or could make a case for applying to some of these funds. I don't know whether being an accredited archive opens up any funding resources. Perhaps you know the answer to that, Audrey.
Well, sorry, I am nodding because actually what I've come across is quite a lot of community archives have objects as well in their collections, and they don't distinguish between the two. And they do have accredited status through, in museum status that is, and they do that through Museums Gallery Scotland. They have 2 levels of accreditation, so you know, you could be a national and a really big one, but also a very small community-led organisations can still apply for accreditation, and it does open up funding streams. But I think, Ruru, you were particularly asking about AV digitisation projects that may come under that umbrella, but I would definitely investigate that, yeah. But I don't know if Katie or Maya have any thoughts on that question about funding. Have either of you looked for external funding?
I'm not sorry, this is Katie. I'm not, there's nothing off the top of my head that I can think of. Potentially a way round, rather than just looking at funding for digitisation, is trying to build your project maybe around sort of community engagement and other events that you could run and have the AV digitisation as a part of that. That might open up more sort of avenues. So if you say that once we have this stuff digitised, we will then run a community film night or something, that might open up and let you tap into more sort of traditional funding avenues, with AV as part of that, even though that's obviously your main aim. The only other thing I might mention is, I think the company Townsweb Archiving, they have a digitisation grant. I don't know if it necessarily applies to AV funding, but certainly I think that's open at the moment, so that might be worth looking at, or something along those lines.
Okay, Maya, have you anything to add to that, or has Katie and Karen said everything?
Not much really. I think what Katie said about trying to link the digitisation to a wider project of exhibition or engagement is probably, rightly or wrongly, is the way to go, and has been found to be effective. I do know we have people from different places. I know the United States has a lot of community digitisation grants, so if you're in the States, that might be something to look at as well. But yes, it's a really, really tricky one, actually. I haven't explored this, but I wonder whether there could be, if you got together with a number of smaller groups who had small amounts of material to digitise, whether you could combine to provide a larger amount of material and then apply to something together, to say whether together you might be able to leverage more funds rather than very small pots of money individually. So, but that's not something I've really explored. So.
Okay. No. Well, No, thank you for that. I'm not seeing any more questions at the moment. We do have another Q&A session at the end when all the speakers will be available. Please keep posting in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to crack on with the next film. It is by Jenny Park, who you've been hearing but not hearing maybe, but this video is actually pre-recorded, so it's going to be perfect. So Jenny is the project manager of Unlocking Our Sound Heritage, and it's a UK-wide project that will help save the nation's sounds and open them up to everyone. The project is funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund and is managed by the British Library with 10 hubs across the UK. So the National Library of Scotland is the only hub for Scotland, and it happens to be the first that is up and running, and they've already started to digitise and catalogue their first collection. So in this video presentation, Jenny asks, why digitise? What will I do with my digitised items? Are my items a priority? So we may get some of the answers to your questions. Thank you.
So you're thinking about digitising. There are different reasons to digitise and different standards that apply based on what you would like to do with the final digital files. Here at the project, we digitise to preservation standards, warts and all, which allows the files to be manipulated in the future. But that may not be necessary by your organisation. The different standards also have an impact on cost of equipment, cost of digital storage, cost of personnel. Is there a particular situation driving the digitisation? If you only need a small part of your collection for an exhibition or on your website, you may not need to digitise everything. Some formats are more stable than others and could wait longer. Your digitisation could be based on conservation needs and have a phased approach. In any argument, it is more valid when backed up with data. If you don't already have the information in your catalogue, collect as much as you can about your audio recordings. The condition of your formats will drive any digitisation for conservation argument. Any rare or unusual contents will drive an argument for public access. And if you know how many items there are, the format and the conservation requirements, you can start to build a cost argument. There are two options for digitisation, in-house or contracted out. In-house will mean significant investment in resources, equipment, knowledge, skills, space to work, time, and if you're going to employ someone, salary expenses. This is a good approach if you have a large collection or if you're building a service for the future. If you contract out the work, it can be costly, especially for a large collection. You may even need to procure services from more than one commercial company if you have some rare formats. You also need to understand what you're contracting for. A large national European organisation had a large collection of compact cassettes which they wanted digitised. They didn't do their research and they contracted out. Unfortunately, they asked for Dolby Off as it was cheaper, but the cassettes had been recorded with Dolby On. The resulting files were useless to them. It had cost a lot of money and was for nothing. There are many organisations that can offer advice, and you can find out more via the Scotland Sounds network. Your organisation probably already undertakes fundraising activities. Perhaps you could do something particular for a digitisation project, or maybe you wish to consider crowdsourcing. Public buy-in to something they're passionate about can be a quick way to fund a project. Perhaps you have a local benefactor, an individual or business who could support your efforts. There are specialised funds available to make applications to, for example, Creative Scotland. There are many more and could be based on the format, the content or the geographical area. The National Lottery Heritage Fund is probably the most well-known funder that many organisations apply to. It is likely to be the place where a larger scale and more expensive project would be considered. However, bear in mind that your project will be competing against a large number of other projects. There are certain things to consider too. Some funders will have prerequisites. So, for example, the National Lottery Heritage Fund will want to see public access for your audio recordings. They will expect to have volunteer involvement and that you will do a certain amount of public outreach or training. This will all add extra resources and costs to your project. This will depend very much on whether you opt for in-house or contracted out and where your funding is coming from. You may wish to consider an audio engineer, a volunteer supervisor, a learning and engagement person. If a large project, there will need to be financial oversight of the budget. You may need to compile regular reports, undertake social media and website activities. For a small project, this might be 1 or 2 people. For a larger project, you may need a whole army of helpers. And presumably your organisation will be continuing with its usual activities, so you will also need to take into account resources pulled away from there. If you're involving volunteers as well as someone to supervise them, there's a lot of preparatory work, insurance, induction, training, health and safety, risk assessments, etc. Volunteer Scotland can help with many areas of advice and training. It may be that you want to appoint a project manager to have overall control of the activities. Again, this would probably only be necessary for a large project. Contracting out, it is still good to have a small group of people overseeing the process. This allows for nothing to be overlooked and would also provide that financial oversight. Once you have your digital files, that is not the end of the story. Make copies, keep them in 2 different places. Keep abreast of how information technology is changing. Although we may be using MP3 and MP4 at the moment, will we still be using them in 10 years or even 5 years' time? You may need to convert your digital files to a new format at some point. Look after your original recordings. If you're concerned about conservation issues once they've been digitised, perhaps consider donating them to a local archive or museum who can maintain them in vault conditions. Thank you, and feel free to contact Scotland Sounds for any support or advice with your project.
So thank you, Jenny, for that. And the next presentation we have follows on very much from Jenny. So you've decided to digitize your collection, but what's really important here is knowing copyright and of course GDPR. And Mel Reeve-Rawlings is the National Library of Scotland's rights clearance officer. And she really does know everything about copyright when it comes to sound and moving images. So let's hear from Mel. Thanks.
Of the interviewer, perhaps an oral history charity or maybe a university. Hello, my name is Mel and I'm the Rights Officer for the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project at the National Library of Scotland, and today we're going to talk about copyright in sound archives. This presentation will look at an overview of my process for clearing sound recordings in terms of copyright. I'm also responsible for the data protection side of things, but this will just cover copyright. So copyright protects fixed, original expressions of creativity. In order to qualify for protection, an idea must be fixed, and recording sound is one example of fixing an idea, so anything that is recorded qualifies for copyright. Any kind of copying of a work that is in copyright counts as infringement unless there is an exception or provision in the law to permit such an act. Copyright is finite, however most of what I work on is still in copyright. Once digitization and cataloguing are complete, I then begin my job, which is to clear recordings to make them available online by getting a license from the copyright holder. Copyright in sound is particularly complicated as it can have many layers, and we call these embedded rights. There will potentially be a different rights holder for each layer of rights. For example, an oral history recording with 2 people, one person interviewing the other, The person making that recording, the sound recordist, owns the copyright in the recording itself. The two people speaking also each own both the copyright in their performance and the literary copyright in what they're saying. However, if one of those people is making or being part of that recording in the course of their employment, then that copyright will automatically belong to their employer unless their contract states otherwise. It is also possible for copyright to be assigned or sold or inherited. It works just like a piece of property. So perhaps the interviewer in that example has given the interviewee a form to complete, which assigns the copyright to the employer the interviewer is working for as well. This would make my life much easier, but it's often not the case. The first thing I do then is to look at who owns what and to check with the relevant people if the people you believe own the copyright do in fact own that copyright. For example, I would interact with the employer of the interviewer, perhaps an oral history charity or maybe a university, to find out what kind of arrangement they had with the interviewer and what documentation there is for interviewees. Once it's determined who the copyright likely belongs to, I think about getting in touch with that rights holder. To find the rights holder, I follow a diligent search process, which is similar to the process required to register an orphan work under the Orphan Works exception. However, if the UK leaves the EU, we will not be able to use this exception, which would enable us to make use of works in copyright where we cannot find a copyright holder. But we still follow the same process, as it's a really good standard for searching for rights holders. However, as mentioned, we cannot rely on that exception for protection if at the end of that search we do not have a license. What we can do is to use it to inform a risk-based judgment about making a recording available online anyway, but that's going to be down to each institution's appetite for risk. I look for a way to contact a rights holder or potentially a family member or descendant if they've died, using a variety of sources. These vary depending on what kind of collection I'm working on, but they include Find My Past, which is a site similar to Ancestry, which has electoral roll and birth, death, marriage records, etc. Google, social media, the British Newspaper Archive, Scottish Land and Property Registers, the Watch File, which is writers, artists and their copyright holders, obituaries, and I may also engage, or I will also engage with the collection holders and curators and the original creators of the collection, as well as any rights holders I can get in contact with who may be able to give me information about other people involved in the project, for example. The success of each of these resources often depends on what kind of collection it is and how notable the people I'm looking for are or were, and this can obviously skew what you make available in favour of people who are likely to be on Who's Who, for example. And I think that shows why it is important to consider reasonable risk. So, for example, if I complete a diligent search and can't get in contact with a rights holder, then that combined with a good takedown policy should likely be enough. Otherwise, the collections we are able to make available will be really skewed in terms of how easy it is to find and contact the rights holders. Once I am able to get in contact with a rights holder, I'm looking to get them to sign a document that grants us a license. We don't ask rights holders to assign copyright, just grant a license, and we use Creative Commons licenses, which are all non-commercial and offer a variety of options depending on what the rights holder feels comfortable with. At this point, it is important to try and build a relationship with that rights holder. I want to make sure that they feel trust in our institution and in what we're doing with the recording, but I obviously never make a rights holder feel pressured to choose one option. I just give them all the information to make a choice and make sure they understand what it would allow us to do if they choose the more open license, which obviously we would prefer. Rights holders often have lots of questions for me, and I do send them all the information in writing, but often I find they feel more comfortable discussing things via email or over the phone with me going through things directly with them. It's also often helpful to explain that we review all recordings for data protection purposes before making them available, which can improve confidence in granting a license, and it gives them an opportunity to flag anything in the recording which we may not already be aware of, which might be a concern, although we do not ask for consent in a data protection context. Some rights holders can be really chatty about how the work was created and give more contextual information, which is often really interesting and even potentially useful. I also find that the first impression is very important, so I try to send documentation via email or letter before I attempt a call if I have a phone number, as people can be quite on guard when they receive what is essentially a cold call. And I do also have to be aware that some of the people I'm contacting might be very elderly or in poor health, or that I could be speaking to someone about a deceased member of their family or a friend. So I have to be really sensitive and respectful when having those conversations. In an ideal world, you'll have been able to find your rights holder and get a license, but it doesn't always work that way. And in these cases, if we don't have time or resource to do that diligent search style approach, then we might want to think about using the exceptions that are available to libraries and archives. And these include providing a single copy of an unpublished work, providing a single copy of a published work, fair dealing for research and private study, illustration for instruction, and criticism or review. But obviously you'll need to look at the full details of when these are applicable to make use of them. So that's a very quick overview of how I work with copyright and sound recordings at the National Library of Scotland for the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project.
Well, I just want to say that that is the end of our series of presentations for this webinar. That was a very interesting one from Mel there. I'm going to ask all the speakers to make themselves available for any questions that you may have. Please put any of your questions on the Q&A box and I can read them out to the speakers. So I have one that's come in, and it's saying, it's a question from Mel. Can I use any clip of music to use with a short film for social media, or must I get permission from the artist? Is there any free music? Can you recommend a website?
Hello.
Hello, Mel.
Hi. So that's a good question. What I would say is that if that music is in copyright, then you would need license permission from the artist. What you could do is there's an exception relating to published material for archives. So I'd have a look at that exception and see if it would cover your use. If not, then there are lots of great resources out there for, you know, royalty-free music. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure perhaps one of my colleagues or someone else in this meeting might have a good idea. But if you have a Google around, I'm sure there'll definitely be some out there. Obviously, if you think about music and recordings, it is obviously rarer to have stuff that's out of copyright, but that doesn't mean there won't be stuff that's out of copyright. So that might be worth looking into as well.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions. I have an inquiry which is saying, will the recording of this webinar be available at a later date? I'm just going to let everyone see my face so you don't have a black square there. Yes, it is going to be made available. We will put it on the SCA website. I can't tell you that's going to be tomorrow. It might take a few days to put it all together. If you're interested in other community archives and heritage events, I really highly recommend that you look on the Twitter on it's at @CArchiveScot. So I will be posting the link to the recorded webinar on that. Otherwise, please do just keep checking the SCA website and we will make sure it's very visible for everyone to see. So I'm not seeing any more questions?
Audrey, this is Jenny. Rory's posted a question in the chat.
Oh, yes, I can see that. Sorry, that's in the chat. Right, okay, I will speak then. You sounded quite good there, Jenny, actually, just to let you know. So Rory's asking, what is the position regarding data protection in AV recordings? Is there a difference, for example, between sound recordings and visual recordings?
Yeah, another very interesting question. So I didn't really touch on data protection much in that presentation, just because it would have been twice as long, basically, because there's a lot to say. But if anyone does want to talk to me more about it, it's one of my favorite things to talk about. So do just drop me an email. So the way data protection works is it really depends what basis you're using for processing personal data. So what we do for the project at the National Library is we use archiving in the public interest as our basis for processing personal data, and then for processing special category data, it's slightly different wording, but basically same meaning, is that it's archiving in the public interest again. So in terms of the difference between sound and visual recordings, I think visual, you're perhaps thinking about maybe more of a risk because people are more identifiable, because obviously you can see what they look like. So, you know, if you have a sound recording where it's just someone's first name, you may say, when you're making that judgment about data protection and risk, if you're using the basis like we are, that, you know, if you don't know that voice really well, then you wouldn't know who that was, which might change the kind of risk level. But obviously, if you're having a visual recording of someone and you can see their face and you have their first name, then you might judge that that is slightly riskier. So I think, as always with data protection, it is entirely dependent on the situation and on under what basis you're processing that personal data. But I think I could imagine that there may be some instances where with visual material, your risk would be slightly different.
It's great. I hope, Rory, that has answered your question. I'm just going to say I'm not seeing anything else. SCA, I can see Robert has put the Twitter account, the details that I was talking about, and Jenny's also mentioned, of course, their Twitter accounts at Scotland Sounds and at NLS Moving Image. Very worthwhile keeping up to date with both of them. But as I'm not seeing any other questions, I don't want to cut anyone short, of course, but I'm checking the Q&A room and I'm also checking the chat room and I'm not seeing anything. So I might just finish it there. So please do, I will advertise when this recording is available, and hopefully we'll be doing something again like this in the future. The speakers have all been very fantastic and kind of providing pre-recordings, but we may actually go on the road again if we're ever allowed out again. We have intentions to do a very similar event somewhere in maybe Inverness and all the community groups that are up there. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to get back to me at Scottish Council and Archives. But I want to thank, as I say, the speakers, and thank you for participating and signing up for this event. Thank you very much. Bye.